BGP Part 5, BGP route aggregation and filtering. In all the BGP nuggets up till now, we have been learning crucial skills to setting up BGP. I mean, things like the foundation BGP configuration. You're not really going to get too far without that. We finished up just a moment ago with the nugget in part 4 on setting up peer groups and route reflectors and confederations, which are key skills to have if you have one of those styles of networks. However, the skills we're going to talk about in this nugget, dealing with route aggregation and filtering, are some of the most crucial skills to have when deploying BGP. You need to know how to summarize routes because your routing table is going to be enormous and you need to filter it down to just what you want to receive. Now, that's the first thing I want to tackle is when you say BGP route aggregation, people just say, well, isn't that just route summarization? Hopefully it is. Hopefully it stays that simple. However, there are many options of aggregation that we're going to go through, and you're going to see a lot of stuff that you may not have expected. I guess that's the best way I could put it, because it's not things that you would expect to see every day, but things that can happen. For instance, you might have a summary route that you need to advertise to one service provider, but maybe the other service provider gets the detailed routes. Well, in all the routing protocols up till now, we've only seen ways to kind of summarize it all, or just summarize for none at all. I mean, there's never really a per neighbor sort of summarization. Or how about this? Maybe you only advertise a summary route if two of the networks that you're summarizing are present. Maybe there's hundreds of networks, but if two of them are missing, you don't want to advertise that summary route anymore. Or maybe you have a conditional route to where it has to meet certain conditions before this route is advertised. Maybe it's an emergency network of last resort that if all the other networks go down, you instantly start advertising this new network that nobody knew about. I mean, things like this, things you wouldn't see every day, but skills that you definitely have to have, especially if you're going for the CCIE. We'll talk about those. Then we'll get into route filtering, screening out the routes that you don't want to either come into your network or go out of your network. We'll look at the three most common methods, using distribute lists, prefix lists, and route maps to screen out undesirable networks from leaving or coming in. Well, our topology has grown a little bit larger that we're going to be deploying, and that'll give us the flexibility to demonstrate just about all of the features. And I'd like to show you a little bit of redistributing into BGP and allowing those routes to be seen from maybe an OSPF network and flood the entire network. And this, seeing an entire network like this with all these autonomous systems will also give us a lot of flexibility with what we can do on route filtering. Well, I'd like to start things off by bringing up, let me go ahead and bring up router 2, and let me, before I do that, show you where router 2 is at. We have this backbone router, which is untouchable by us, that's running OSPF and injecting a bunch of routes. Router 2 is grabbing those routes and is going to redistribute them into BGP. Now, I have not configured any BGP on this network at all, because I'd like to kind of almost gear this nugget as a review of a lot of the concepts that we've seen in all the nuggets and see it all kind of come together into one big scenario. So let's jump on router 2, and the first thing I'm going to do is a show IP route, so that we can see what routes that we have in our table. And we see all these OSPF routes. Looks like 172.22, 33, 44, and so on. 192.168 routes also, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 up here. So we're getting all these routes in our table. Now let's get into the privilege mode and go into BGP. I'm going to type in router BGP. Let's check our autonomous system, 7500. So I'm into router BGP process, and I'm going to type in neighbor 10.12.1.1, that's router 1 up there, and I'll put remote AS 7500. That tells it you are going to have an iBGP session with router 1. Now I need to get those OSPF routes over here. So let's just do basic redistribution. I'll do a redistribute OSPF, and then I'll say OSPF process 1 is the process that I chose. And from here I can say what routes I want to redistribute. Do I want to set a wait for when they come into BGP? Do I want to use a route map to filter some of those routes or modify attributes as they come in? Or do I want to set a metric, which in BGP isn't really necessary? Remember, the metric is essentially just what you can recommend to people for coming into your autonomous system. It's not really a true valid metric as we've all come to know and love it. So I'm just going to say redistribute OSPF1, and that will take those OSPF routes out of the table. and put them into the BGP table. I'll do a show IP BGP, see if they're there yet. And sure enough, they are. We have all of these routes that are coming in, 172.16, 192.168. So we're seeing where they're coming from. Now let's go over to router 1. So now router 1, get into global config. I'll do router BGP 7500. And the neighbor that I have for here is 10.12.1.2 remote AS 7500 iBGP neighbor. Now there's one thing I'd like to do, and that is over here. Now I see this 172.16 network.12. It is being advertised into OSPF. However, I just want to make sure that router 2 sets itself as the next hop. So I'm going to say for the neighbor, let me get into the router BGP 7500. For the neighbor 10.12.1.1, I want to do a next hop self, just so that I can apply that and make sure that router 1 can reach 10.12.1.2 that is sitting right behind here. Otherwise, we may have next hops coming out here, and backbone 1, who knows what's behind there. We could have routes coming in with next hops that are kind of unheard of. So I just want to make sure they're all on the same page. So let's hop over to router 1 again. And I'm going to do, it shows the neighbor came up, show IP BGP. Just see that these routes came in, and sure enough, all the next hop is correct. And it looks like they are being chosen. They're internal routes. They are iBGP routes. It shows, oh, take a look at this, the path. The path is a question mark, which means incomplete. Now, up till now, we've been seeing I as the path because we've been using the network statement to get those routes into BGP routing process. The question mark says, I'm not too sure where these routes came from. That's typically when you redistribute routes. Now, we can use route maps and actually modify that path attribute to change it, but there's not really any reason to do so right now. I'm going to do a show IP BGP. Oh, how about show IP route? And I'm going to see all these BGP routes that are coming into the table. Great. So what we've done is we now have redistribution occurring from OSPF into BGP. We have plenty of routes. Router 1's learning about them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video, and I'm going to set up all the neighbor relationships between all these routers. So by the time it's said and done, we should be able to see all of those routes over here on router 5. Then we'll get into the summarization. Okay, it's done. I have BGP deployed on all of these routers, and I'm going to bring up router 4 to verify all the connections. And let me hop over to the right router here. Oh, there we go. Router 4. I'm going to do a show IP BGP, and let me just flip back to the topology to familiarize yourself. Router 4 is sitting right here connected to the WAN link, connected off to router 5 and router 6. So I'm looking at router 4, and sure enough, it shows those routes have shown up here. We have those redistributed routes coming from Autonomous System 7500, and they are tagged with the valid and best. So they should be in the routing table if we do a show IP route, and they are. Now let's hop over to router 5. I'm going to do a show IP BGP. Looks like it was already in the buffer there. Show IP BGP, and what we have here is we have all the routes showing up. It's learned via BGP, but now they are not tagged as best. You see the valid but not best configuration. If I do a show IP route, they are not showing up in the table. Now again, this goes back to, does router 5 know about the next hop to get to those routes? I'm looking right here. The next hop is 10.14.1.1. That's up here. You might look and say, well, why isn't the next hop one of these? Doesn't it change? Well, remember, when you have iBGP peers, it does not change the next hop. It's supposed to be a kind of helpful hop-saving mechanism that's built into BGP, but I'll tell you what, it causes more harm than good, I've seen in my experience. So what we need to do is hop over to router 4, go into router BGP 2500, and type in, for each one of those neighbors, I'm going to say neighbor 1045.15, 1045.15, next hop self. We'll also hit the up arrow and change it over for the neighbor down below, 10.46.1.6. It's going to have the same problem because it doesn't know about that network up here. I'm going to change that to next hop self. So at this point, those next hops should change and be reachable. Now, while we are on router 4, do you notice anything else we might have to configure on router 4? Let's look at it. If router 5 were to advertise 10.50.0 and advertise that into this network, then what would happen is router 4 would not send it down here. Remember that whole route reflector rule? So router 4 is the ideal route reflector for router 5 and router 6. So let's just hit the up arrow while we have everything here in the buffers. Now I'll say, oh, route reflector client. 10.6, route reflector client. So I have now those two route reflector clients because we will need to advertise this 10.50 and 10.60 network. However, this one will now allow them to go through and meet successfully. So let me bring that back up, hop over to router 5, and just do a show IP BGP, because hopefully those are showing up. Oh, they're still not. Oh, yes, they're still not good because we still have synchronization on. I'm going to go into router BGP. I'm telling you, I go through this every time I set up BGP. There's always something that causes those not to show up as good routes. I'm going to go into router BGP 2500 on both router 5 and router 6. BGP 2500. And do a no synchronization. And remember, synchronization is that horrid rule that says all of the routes learned via BGP must be confirmed by an interior gateway protocol like RIP or OSPF before they will be believed. So in this case, router 5 hears about them but does not believe them because it's still waiting for some sort of interior protocol to tell them that they are correct. Now let's check it. Show IP BGP. We're still not, let me do a clear IP. We've done a lot of changes without ever clearing the sessions. So I'm going to hop between both of router 5 and router 6 to a clear IP BGP star. I'm also going to hop over to router 4, do a no sync here, just to be sure. And at that point, we should be okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop over to router 5. It's going to take a sec for those BGP sessions to come back up. So I'm going to pause the recording, hit the show IP BGP again, and we should see all those routes showing up as valid. There we go. It only took a moment longer for those routes to show up. You can see right after I paused the recording, the neighbor came up, and then I just did a show IP BGP. They're all now showing up as valid. So at this point in time, router 5, and router 6 for that matter, I just want to make sure our topology is in good shape, should be having those BGP routes show up in the routing table. So at this point, they should be able to ping any of those networks. They are all available. Good. So we have that foundation topology laid. Hopefully that was a good review for a lot of the concepts we've been talking about in the nuggets up till now. Now let's get a little more advanced. The first thing that I want to do is show you some basic route summarization or aggregation with BGP, and then we'll start getting fancy with the options. I'm going to do a show IP BGP to just show the BGP routes. And I set this up to where we could just summarize very easily on some basic network boundaries. I'd like to summarize just 172, and then you can see 192.168. It's a great summary point with an 8-bit and a 16-bit mask. And the best place to do that early on is over on router 1. So here's how you do route summarization. Over on router 1, I'm going to jump into router BGP 2500. Let me just... Oh, 7500. Got to remember these autonomous system numbers. Let me just go ahead and clear off this this window so we can kind of start from a fresh slate and get all the gibberish out of our screen. Okay. To make basic BGP route aggregation happen, it's not too much more difficult than any other routing protocol with route summarization. Here's the command. I'm just going to type in on router 1 aggregate address, followed by what I want my aggregate address to be. Let's go ahead and take out that 172 subnet that we had all the more specific routes for. And we just type in our aggregate address, our aggregate mask, I can say that, and then follow it up with our options. Now, here's the catch. If I just hit enter right here, router 1 does something that's really silly. It's going to advertise your summary route along with all the more specific routes to all the routers that it's connected to. So in your attempt to summarize, you've actually caused your routing table to get more, to get larger because you're now adding an extra route to it that doesn't need to be there. Definitely, if you're just doing basic summarization, always follow it up with the summary only keyword. That says only advertise this summary address and suppress all of the other routes that match this address. So when I do a show IP BGP, I'm looking at all my routes. You still see these routes in there and you go, oh no, they're still there. But if you look at the key, Now they are suppressed. The little S stands for suppressed. So as router 1 sends its advertisements out to its neighbors, it's going to be able to suppress them. And now if we hop on over, let's go and jump up to router 3 since we can see it on the screen. I'll do a show IPBGP, and what I see is now all of those networks combined into one. Basic route summarization is not hard at all. It's when you want to get fancy that it starts to get difficult. So let's get fancy. When we use the aggregate address command with the summary only keyword, it works great. But the problem is it summed up all the 172 networks for all neighbors. So router 3 gets it, router 2 or router 4 gets it down here at 172.0.0.0 with an 8-bit mask. But let's say our neighbors didn't want that. Let's say that maybe router 3 needs the summary route. Maybe it's an internet service provider, but router 4 is maybe a second tier internet service provider that has direct connections over here to our branch offices, or, you know, paint whatever situation you want to. The story is one of these routers needs a summary route, the other does not. With the aggregate address command deployed as we have it, it's not going to be able to happen because it's summarizing it for everybody. So let me show you a different way to do summarization. I'm going to bring up router 1 again, and I'm going to go into router BGP 7500. Remembered it this time. I'm going to first off type in no aggregate address 172.0.0.0.255.0.0.0, enter. That'll wipe out all the configuration we had before with the summary only keyword. Now I'm going to hit the up arrow and do the same thing. Oh, hit the wrong control key to get out of there. Router BGP 7500. Let me go up again. No. Sorry about that. Now I'm going to hit the question mark because I want to show you a feature that we can tack on to this aggregate address command. We've already used the summary only. Let me show you the suppress map. Now what I'm going to do may sound a little redundant at first and might look a little pointless, but when you see the whole thing, it'll turn out to be a beautiful thing. We have this suppress map which says conditionally filter more specific routes from updates. So let me hit the backspace, make sure that aggregate address command doesn't go in there. Here's how we can use a suppress map. I'm going to create an access list. I'll say access list, let's do 30. And what I'm going to do is permit any address that starts with 172. So anything that starts with 172 will match this access list. Got that? Now I'm going to create a route map, and I'm going to say this route map name will be suppress. And what I'm going to do, well, you know what? I'm not going to use that name because otherwise it's going to get really confusing when I start explaining this. I'm going to call this route map block. Sound good? And I'm going to match the IP address specified in access list 30. So I've got a route map that's named block that will match anything starting with 172.0, anything starting with 172. So, following so far? Now I'm going to get into router BGP 7500, and I'm going to type that aggregate address command. Let me just get the up arrow back up to it. Aggregate address, and I'm going to follow it up with a suppress map of block, the route map that I just defined. Now, looking at that, you might be thinking, wow, he just did exactly the same thing that I did with the summary only, just a different way. That's absolutely correct, and it's the same result right now. I created an aggregate address. I created that route map called block, and it's blocking everything starting with 172. So here's the rest of the story. I'm going to go to a specific neighbor. Let's use 10.14.1.2. They wanted the more specific routes. They didn't want just the summary. Router 3 only gets the summary. So I'm going to go to those neighbors, and I'm going to type in neighbor 10.14.1.2. That's router 4. And I'm going to do a feature, and it's going to be mind-blowing. It's called an unsuppress map. Wow. So what this does is I'm going to say, for this neighbor, I want to unsuppress the route map of block. And that will override the aggregate address suppression that's suppressing the route map. So one suppresses, one unsuppresses. Let me go out here. That since I did modify the neighbor, I do need to do a clear IPBGP star to reset my neighbor relationships. Well, it'll take a moment for those to come back up. But what this will do is it will say for router 3, I'm suppressing them. For this neighbor, I am not suppressing them. And the truth be told, any neighbor that we add on from here on out will have them suppressed by default unless we do the same command for that specific neighbor. So what that does is it allows just the neighbors that we want to have the more specific routes. So I'm waiting for that neighbor relationship. Oh, one of them came back up. Let's wait for the other two to come back up, and we should be able to go over and verify. And as a matter of fact, let me hop over to router 4. Oh, I think router 4 just came back up. Well, let's do router 3 first. I'm going to do a show IPBGP summary to make sure the neighbor relationship is back, and it is 7 seconds ago. Let's do a show IPBGP. So router 3 should still have just the summary because they're the ones that has the suppression taking place. Now, the true test. Let's hop over to router 4. Show IPBGP. Look at that, guys and gals. We have all of the more specific routes. They are now unsuppressed. And look at that. We have the summary route as well. It says, you know, the aggregate address is suppressing them, but we're still getting that aggregate address over here. But we're also getting all the unsuppressed routes. Awesome. I love this stuff. So now we've got a problem. Not really a problem, but just kind of a mess. We have a summary route for all the more specific routes that we already have. It's not going to cause any problems. However, it just adds to our BGP routing table. So let's take a turn into the filtering. I want to block that route. How can I do it? Well, let's hop on over to router 1. Let me clear off the screen. Let's start getting into the route filtering section. I'd like to show you 3 methods of route filtering. 2 of which are functional, and 1 of which I prefer. It's my preferred method. It's using route maps, but I'll show that to you last. First off, the functional methods. We saw that router 4 has that summary route, somewhere around here. Router 4 is getting that summary route, but all the more specific networks from our aggregation magic. And what I want to do is filter out that 172.0.0.0 network from going to router 4. So what I'm able to do, let me do a show IPBGP on router 1. Here's my route I want to filter. I'm going to go into global config mode, and I want to create an access list. I'm going to say access list. Now I know I created one that matched that network before, but I want to get more specific this time. I'll call it access list 25. And from here I'm going to say deny 172.0.0.0. Now this wildcard mask is going to be exact, 0.0.0.0. The reason I didn't put any 255s was I'm saying I want to filter out just this one network. If I put in any of the wildcards in there, the 255s, I might catch some of these routes as well and filter them from going to router 4 when router 4 should be getting them. Now I need to follow that up with an access list 25, permit any, to allow all other networks to go across. Now I'm going to go into router BGP 7500. And the first method that I want to show you is called a distribute list. Distribute list we've seen probably from many of the other protocols, OSPF, RIP, they all support this feature called a distribute list, and so does BGP. Now if I just type in distribute list from right here and type in the access list 25 and then I get to choose the direction, whether I want to filter inbound or outbound updates. Well, if I want to keep router 4 from getting it, it would be out. If I hit it right there and pressed enter, router 1 would now filter that summary route from everybody. It will say, I will receive it and I can hear about it, but I will never send 172.0.0.0 to any neighbor. So, a little too broad. That's a way that we can filter it from all our routers. In this case, I just want a specific neighbor, so why not drill down? 10.14.1.2 is the neighbor that I'm concerned with, and now I can type in distribute list 25 out. Now, anytime that you change any of your route filter settings for a neighbor, you have to clear the BGP neighbor relationships. So I'm going to type in a clear IPBGP, and I'll clear them all. This will reset them. It'll probably take about 30 to 45 seconds to rebuild. So I'm going to pause things over here, and when they come back up, I'll restart, and we'll go over and check router 4 and see if it has lost that summary route. And there they are. They've come back up. So let's hop on back over to router 4. And do a show IPBGP, and we should see that that route has been filtered, and sure enough it has. We don't have that summary route anymore. That is one of the ways that you can do a specific route filter. Now, that's not my preferred way, and the reason why is it just doesn't have finesse. I don't know. It's once you learn how to use route maps and you learn how to use them with BGP, you find that you like to use them for everything. They're so flexible and so manipulatable, if that's a word, that we can add any functionality to those route maps and do route filtering as well. So I like to use route maps, but distributes lists, I got to give them credit, they do work. The second method, and it's again not so preferred because I don't like how it the bit notation kind of gets a little confusing, but it's called a prefix list. Some of you may have heard of these before. You go into global config mode and do an IP prefix list and follow it up with the name of the prefix list that you want to create. Cisco created these as kind of an answer to the access list dilemma, where once you create an access list, you're doomed because you have to continue adding on to that access list forever. You can't really delete lines or squeeze lines in between. In recent versions of the iOS, however, they fixed access lists. So now with a named access list, you can do just about anything. You have sequence numbers, you can squeeze things in. Prefix list was kind of the intermediary answer. They're not as popular as Cisco wanted them to be because I think people just got used to the feel of access lists, and prefix lists just felt very odd. So let me show you how you can use a prefix list to filter with BGP and do essentially the same thing I did with the distribute list. I can come into prefix list and I name it, so I can maybe name it filter underscore BGP. Oh, and then I need to type in whether or not it's permitted, denied, what I'd like to do with this prefix list. So I'm going to say this one is to deny, and I get to type in the specific network followed by a bit notation. Say goodbye to the wildcard mask. That was Cisco's big selling point for the prefix list, is that you would be able to kiss the wildcard mask goodbye. So I'm going to type in 172.0.0.0/8, and I would hit enter. Now this is the same thing as going to a wildcard mask and going to an access list and using a wildcard mask of all zeros. It will match specifically that network. Now if you wanted to do like a kind of a similar thing to a wildcard mask of maybe 0.255.255.255 and match all 172, then what you would use is these greater than and less than bit notations. They pretty much accomplish the same thing. However, I hardly use the greater than because it gets confusing to me. I learned it one way and I always use the less than. Here's what it's going to mean. I'm going to type in LE followed by 32. What that means is I'm going to match 172.16.0.0/8, meaning 172 is the only thing that I'm caring about because it says anything with less than 32 bits also matches. So that says the rest of these 24 bits right here, which is between 8 and 32, are all wildcards at that point. That's your way of doing wildcards in prefix lists. And again, I think this is the major reason why people like access lists is once they got used to the wildcard mask, this way just kind of was mind-boggling. But it does work. Now it does work just like an access list, so I need to go under here and I need to do a permit any statement, but instead of saying permit any, what I'm going to do is do 0.0.0/0 LE32. That's the same thing as your permit any statement. To apply this, I would go under router BGP 7500, and I would go to that specific neighbor again, neighbor 10.14.1.2, and I would say prefix list followed by the name of our prefix list, filter BGP, and then I'd get to say inbound or outbound. Now I'm not going to apply that command because it does exactly the same thing as our distribute list. As a matter of fact, what I'd like to do is hit the up arrow a few times, and I'd like to remove our distribute list from that neighbor and clear the configuration. Because those are the first two functional methods. Now I'd like to show you my preferred method, which is going to use a route map. Now those two methods are nice to know because route maps do a lot of things, and you may have a route map applied that's maybe tweaking some attributes and maybe tweaking some attributes. That's the only thing I can think of right now. However, the route maps could be applied for many different things. So you might say, Well, I'll have my route map setting the attribute functions for BGP, but then I'm going to apply a distribute list over here to do the route filtering, or a prefix list over here to do the route filtering. So that way you don't have this enormous route map that just gets mind-boggling to manage. You can kind of apply these different functions to it to accomplish the same thing in a much more easy to understand sort of way. So I'm going to go ahead and clear this off, let these neighbor relationships continue to form. Oh, let me catch that one as well. And then we'll get into the route map configuration. So before we get into global config and then route map configuration mode, let me do a show IP access list here so we can see what access list we have created, mainly for me, so I can refresh myself and go, oh, it was 25 that had the deny specifically 172.0.0.0. The other ones were wildcard masks that would catch all of them. So 25 is the one that we're going to use. And while we're here, I also want to jump over to router 4. Do a show IP BGP. I want to make sure that we've removed all the filters and we're back to the normal. Yep, there we are, because it has a lot more effect when you can see it actually go away rather than thinking it was gone the whole time. So we still have that summary route in the table. Now let's get into the route map and configure it to filter that one out. I'm going to create a route map, and we'll call it, be a creative name, filter BGP, right? Now, under here, you can just hit enter and it will allow you to do the standard permit, and it will start with sequence number 10. So I'm going to do that. I don't need to specify any sequence numbers, and I'm in route map configuration mode. The first thing that I want to do is I want to just say match IP access. Oh, I'm thinking access list, but it's address. Match IP address, and then I get to say an access list number. And I'm going to say 25. Now remember, 25 had the deny statement saying deny 172.0.0.0 and permit everything else. So I've applied that access list right here. From there, I'm going to get out of route map configuration mode, get into router BGP 7500, and I'm going to apply it to that neighbor. Neighbor 10.14.1.2, route map, and I'll call it filter BGP, and I'll say outbound. Enter. That's all I need to do at that point. It's now filtering BGP. Now you might look at that and go, well, that seemed to be nearly exactly the same process as a distribute list. It's just we called it a route map rather than a distribute list. And I have to admit, there is some truth to that statement. There's a lot of truth to that statement. It's a very similar thing. While I'm talking, let me have some production going on in the background and clear those neighbor relationships. It's a very similar process. The reason that I prefer route maps is because route maps are so flexible. We just filtered out that network, but in that same breath, we could have said, you know what? I want to set all of those 172 networks with some sort of BGP attribute that says, maybe some are preferred over other, maybe this neighbor is preferred over another, maybe we're setting the metric, the local preference. The route map allows you to set any BGP attribute, and that will actually be what we get into in the following nugget, in the next nugget coming up when we go through how to set all those BGP attributes. The reason I like setting it in a route map right here, and I'm seeing all these neighbors come up, I'm waiting for 1014. The reason I like seeing it in a route map is because it's kind of a central place to do everything. Let me just do a show route map here. What we can see, I've got a couple of them, but the one I want to focus on right here is filter BGP. That's the one that we just applied. It's permit sequence number 10, and we matched IP access list 25, which said to deny 172 and permit everything else. Now that is just sequence number 10. We can have sequence number 20, 30, 40, and keep going up all the way down, and each sequence number of this route map can add something else, some other thing that we apply to this configuration, setting an attribute of some sort. And you can apply them inbound and outbound. So it's a good focused place to apply all of those. So let's hop over to router 4, do a show IP BGP, just to make sure that indeed you see 172.0.0.0 is gone. Now there is one thing I do want to hit before we wrap things up, and that is the route map deny statement. You can see in all my route maps, I have route map, in this case filter BGP, permits. Down here was from earlier demonstrations that we did. We have route map suppress, spelled incorrectly, and we have permit. Route map block, permit. Every single one of them says permit. And I've commonly been asked the question, when would it ever deny something? Well, the truth be told is if you set up your route maps correctly, you don't have to deny things very often at all. It's just a different form of logic. Here's the idea. I'm going to create a route map that does exactly the same thing that we just did right here, except using a deny statement instead. I'm going to create an access list, and this is going to be mind-blowing. Access list, let's do 23. I know I haven't used that. And I'm going to say permit 172.0.0.0, wildcard mask of all zeros. And then from there, I'm just going to leave it blank. Watch this. I'm going to type in route map. Yep, if I can type it. Route map. I'm going to say reverse logic is the name. And I'm going to say deny is going to be the statement, and I'll say sequence number 10. From here, I'm going to match IP address 23, which matches the access list I just created. And now, if I applied this route map to the neighbor relationship, I would have done exactly the same thing that I did with the permit. Huh? It's true. What I've done is I've said, I'm going to permit 172.0.0.0 in the access list. And what I've done in the route map is I've said, with this reverse logic, I want to deny the network that is permitted here. So what does that mean? That means that it will deny 172.0.0.0 and then permit everything else. Why everything else? Well, remember, at the end of every access list is an implicit deny. And by doing this, this is why I hate using deny, but by doing this, I am denying the denied networks from being denied. Wow. Mind-blowing. So it does the same thing. It's just you have to sit there and ponder all of that, and then you end up in thinking about your belly button fuzz and everything else, because it's just, you don't want to do it. That's my point. I'm going to do a show route map, and I just want you to see that everything that you can do with a permit can be done with a deny. It's just all reverse logic. It does have its specific niche circumstances where there is times where you might have a broad permit and then you have to say, well, I want to deny this, this, and this, and squeeze in sequence numbers before it. But overall, I'm telling you, if you just stick with permit the entire time and use your access list as the denies, it's much less confusing. Awesome. That's why I love BGP. Is it's so configurable by any administrator that you can have it do just about anything that you want it to. It just takes some work. And I know in this nugget, we've just hit the high points of aggregation and filtering and looked at 3 major methods. And I shouldn't say high points because we have gotten pretty down and gritty with them. However, the reason I kind of feel that way is just wait to the next nugget. Wait until we get into all of the attributes that you're able to tweak with BGP. It's then that you'll see the real power of those route maps. The first thing that we went through in this nugget is to demystify route aggregation. It's not just route summarization. There's a lot that you can do with aggregation in BGP that could never be done with other protocols, such as aggregating for specific neighbors. We also looked at the many options of aggregation. There's different ways that you can do it. We looked at doing an aggregate address for everybody. We started looking at using a suppress map. You can also do aggregation just by redistributing static routes into your table. That sums things up, and then filtering out the more specific routes. Not something that we've done, but it's something that I've seen administrators do. And it's a very easy way to do aggregation without getting into the suppress and unsuppressed way. We finally wrapped it up with route filtering, and we looked at using distribute lists, first off, along with prefix lists, as kind of the functional ways of doing route filtering. But then we looked at route maps as kind of the finesse way, the way to do it with style, because you can set many other things than just what's filtered. We're going to explore a lot of those in the upcoming nuggets. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.